Ivan, I think we can start. Okay, thank you for that, Ivan. Welcome to everyone to this event called Indigenous Peoples and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Review of the first decade of the implementation and recommendations of the UN Guiding Principles, or we will call it UNGP, and the roadmap from Indigenous peoples' perspectives as well as from other actors. This event is co-organized by the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International and the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs in cooperation with the UN Next Decade on Business and Human Rights, and also with the Permanent Mission of Denmark to the UN in Geneva. This event is taking place on the side of the meeting of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, of which the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights will be presenting its report on the 10-year implementation on June 29. This is the reason why we're having this event, to put a spotlight on Indigenous peoples as one of the critical actors and rights holders on the issue of business and human rights. It is also important for us to hear the perspectives of other actors from government, from business, and also from the UN Working Group. So we are very happy to have representatives from these groups to join us in this event, and of course, with Indigenous leaders. Before we continue, oh, by the way, just to introduce myself, I forgot, I'm Joanne Carling. I am an Akan Kanaay from the Philippines, and I work with the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. Now, without wasting time, I would like that we now proceed with the opening remarks and we are very happy to have the ambassador of the Danish mission in Geneva with us, Mr. Jesper Mortensen, and he is the Danish ambassador extraordinary and permanent representative to the UN and WTO. He is the former Undersecretary of Global Development and Cooperation in the Danish Development Organization with the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Jesper Mortensen has over 25 years of experience in development cooperation and foreign affairs, including areas such as foreign development policy, employment in developing countries, development and implementation of humanitarian efforts and development cooperation. Before I give you the floor, sir, I would just like to acknowledge the sustained support of the Danish government to the rights, interest, and welfare of Indigenous people. So I'm happy that you have agreed to join us. So I give you the floor now, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much also to IPRI and Indigenous Peoples' Rights International for organizing this important event. And again, thank you also for inviting me to give the opening remarks. Promoting and protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and fostering business respect for human rights are two key priorities for Denmark, not least during our membership of the Human Rights Council. And they are, of course, often closely linked. Indigenous peoples continue to be among the groups most affected by adverse human rights impacts of the business activities. In 2011, the guiding principles on business and human rights were endorsed at the consensual global global framework to promote the effective prevention of business-related human rights harm and remedy for the victims, including not least the Indigenous peoples. That marked only the end of the beginning. We have come a long way, but the potential for broader and deeper implementation of the guidelines is immense. Denmark is committed to pursuing the best smart mix of measures, national, international, mandatory and voluntary, to foster business respect for human rights. Let me congratulate you, IWGIA and IPRI, on your comprehensive report on progress achieved, the implementation gap and challenges for the next decade. While some of your findings are encouraging, many are concerning. New and emerging threats, such as increasing violence and killings of indigenous land and of indigenous environmental defenders, are the growing trends towards criminalization through anti-terror laws, clearly call for further efforts to promote and protect the rights of indigenous peoples. To that end, legislation within the European Union requiring companies to adopt due diligence measures in their value chain would be an important step forward. Denmark supports such legislation. Also, the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct remain an important framework, we believe. Hopefully, in the next 10 years, we will see the establishment of more effective mechanisms to prevent and remedy business-related human rights abuses. Your report and today's event is one small but important step towards achieving that. I wish all of us a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thanks as well for sharing some thoughts in the next 10 years, especially the issue of legislation on human rights due diligence, and also the establishments of mechanism for redress. I think these are very critical areas where much of improvement is needed as we move to the next decade. So thanks again, Ambassador, for your kind remarks and also your continuing support to Indigenous peoples. Now we will move on to the discussion that we will have further on this topic. But before that, I would like to introduce first our 5 speakers, and I will be asking them questions to respond. But let me first acknowledge and appreciate the presence here of the chair of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. He is a master's in political science from the Catholic University of Chile and a master's in public administration from Harvard University. He is the founder and executive director of the Vincular Center for Social Responsibility and Sustainable Development at the Catholic University at Valparaiso, Chile. Working also in 14 Latin American countries since 2001. So we are very much privileged to have with us Dante Pese, the chair of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So maybe I can proceed now to ask the question to Dante. As the chair of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, kindly share to us an overview summary on the progress, gaps, and challenges on the UNGP implementation in general and in relation to Indigenous peoples. We would also like to hear from you on any response to the report on the UN Guiding Principles and Human Rights and Indigenous peoples, which the ambassador also referred to earlier. So Dante, you can take the floor now.
Yes, thank you, Joan, and the organizers of this event. It will be my pleasure to divide into my intervention. One is an official statement, an intervention from the working group angle, answering your first question. And the second one is a short reflection on the report that you have published, the updated report, because there was a previous version, and I can make some comments to what I have read in it. So it will be my pleasure. It is a great pleasure to be able to join today's event in my capacity as chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Thank you to the organizers. I'm also very pleased to be on the panel with my former working group colleague, Pavel Sulyansinga, who actually was somehow my coach in the connection between business and human rights and indigenous people. And sorry for confessing my ignorance, but clearly I felt very, very ignorant while I was being coached by Pavel. So thank you. And I know he's looking at me right now. As you know, the working group has a mandate to promote the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the UNGPs. For the past year, we have been undertaking a project to take advantage of the landmark 10th anniversary of the Guiding Principles, which we marked last week on the 16th. This project, known as UNGPs 10 Plus, has two key outputs. First, an assessment or stock taking of the first 10 years of implementation by states and by business. Second, the stock taking will be followed by a roadmap for the next decade later in the year. We want to finalize that exercise by October 31st. And of course, you're absolutely welcome, as you have been always welcome, to help in this effort and to, of course, include your perspective in this process that we are conducting right now. We released the stock taking report at the anniversary last week. It was accompanied by an assessment of the performance of institutional investors. The stock taking has been supported by a range of stakeholders' inputs. Between July last year and February, we organized more than 30 virtual consultations ad hoc ones, plus more than 40 participation in other events that we were invited as an opportunity to listen to the different stakeholders and the right holders. So they were organized by our team and partners with partners that supported the project. We received more than 200 written contributions, one of them yours, a very substantive one, I have to say. Engaging with Indigenous people has been an important aspect, and I would like to thank the organizers of this event for their tremendous support in facilitating inputs from Indigenous peoples networks around the world. I will also like to congratulate you for your own report on the first 10 years of the Guiding Principles. The initial version was an important reference for our stock taking, and your final report will provide a very useful resource both to our further work and for others actors in this field. In addition, I would like to acknowledge the contributions of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus at the annual Forum on Business and Human Rights as part of our regular collaboration with the Caucus, supported by DOSIP. Same thing is happening on regular basis in Latin America. We also had a dedicated consultation supported by First Peoples worldwide. Let me first share some high-level findings from the working group's stock-taking. The wider context to our stock-taking is, of course, the global crisis we are living through. Not only the ongoing COVID crisis, but also the existential climate crisis, inequalities, and discrimination of marginalized groups. The Guiding Principles foresaw many of the key challenges we still need to overcome. Ineffective prevention by states and business, especially one that is based on meaningful stakeholder engagement. As we know all too well, and you especially, meaningful engagement with affected communities is a big gap, especially in the context where it's most needed. Significant barriers to access to remedy for victims of business-related impacts. The barriers remain the highest, especially for the most marginalized and vulnerable. Lack of policy coherence in government and at the multilateral level. Acknowledgement that respect for people and environment is a must for sustainable development is still the exception among ministries in charge of economic activities. The same applies in the practice of most international finance institutions. Lack of coherence in business practice. Too few business demonstrates the understanding that commitment to human rights is not compatible with legal action against human rights defenders, to take but just one example. Yet, our stock-taking clearly underlines that we are in a better position now than 10 years ago. But the gaps, and many of the gaps that we have seen seen some progress, and in some cases, important progress, and I will describe some of them. Most importantly, the UN Guiding Principles provide a globally agreed standard for what governments and business need to do to embed respect for human rights in a business context. We see the glass half full or half empty, but at least we are seeing the same glass. The framework is understood and accepted by all players, which was not the case 10 years ago. Namely, states must protect human rights, business need to respect human rights, and there needs to be access to remedy when people are harmed. They have clarified the different but complementarily roles of states and business, and has helped put an end to the discussion on whether business should or not respect human rights. Today, that is not disputed. They should. By making access to remedy for victims a core pillar, the guiding principles have helped shift focus from corporate philanthropy to accountability as an essential feature of responsible business. The UN Guiding Principles provide the common language and action platform. This normative development is easy to overlook, but has been an essential step for progress. It provides civil society and those representing affected people, indigenous people organizations, human and environmental defenders, and trade unions with a framework to monitor states and business and demand accountability. Perhaps the greatest contribution is the human rights due diligence concept that the guiding principles introduced. It provides both normative and operational guidance. We have seen significant uptake of this concept over the last 10 years, but certainly we recognize that there is a very big gap between good intentions and declarations and practical and effective implementation. We have seen significant uptake of this concept over the last 10 years. The uptake by leading business is crucial. So is the uptake by a wider range of actors that influence and shape business conduct, from financial institutions and investors to business organizations. With the mandatory waive, the due diligence standard is transforming towards a legally binding standard. We need to reinforce and expand this foundation to build further coherence to be able to ensure impact where it matters most, on the ground. Simply put, the roadmap for the next 10 years can be summed up in one word: implementation. Implementation of the guiding principles should be at the center of a responsible recovery from the current crisis and to build back better. As our stocktaking underlines, the road to a just transition to a greener economy also goes through respect for people. Yet, the guiding principles will not implement themselves. We need to increase the pace of implementation. Governments and business need to do the job, supported by other stakeholders. States need to develop effective laws and regulations, but also to use the wider range of policy tools, the smart mix, to incentivize responsible business and due diligence and enable access to remedy for victims. While increasing commitments by business are encouraging, we need to move beyond leaders. Benchmarking initiatives also highlight that we need to address the apparent disconnect between improvements at the policy level and human rights due diligence in practice. Protecting and respecting rights of indigenous people affected by business is a key issue for the next decade. In practice, to realize it, a lot of concrete steps are needed. States need to enable participation of indigenous people in national action plan processes. Companies and investors need to engage with indigenous peoples as part of their due diligence. States needs to remove barriers to access remedy when rights of indigenous people are harmed. And business need to design grievance mechanisms that are sensitive to indigenous communities, including the particular challenges
Indigenous
faced by
peoples
women
all
and
business and
defenders of indigenous
an
rights.
NAP
Indigenous
changes
peoples
and
organizations themselves can continue to apply the guiding principles in their work and play a role in strengthening, monitoring, and tracking progress in collaboration with other stakeholders. Finally, all of you can reinforce the call on governments and business to step up. The first opportunity to join the call on states is at the UN Human Rights Council next week, but we need to hear it loud and clear throughout the anniversary year. Once again, I'm grateful for the opportunity today and look forward to continue the engagement with all of you and other partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dante. That was a very substantive overview on the progress, gaps, and also based on the stock taking that you made. But let me highlight some of the things that you mentioned. For those that are new to this, I think Dante has clearly specified what the UN Guiding Principles is all about, which is the respect, protect, and access to remedy as obligations of states and business. Now, it's good to hear that there's movement now, and I can see that also with companies, that there's more awareness on the impact of business to human rights, but also the movement for human rights due diligence. The process of putting that in place is a very good step. But the one that you mentioned in terms of the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles in the context of the pandemic is very, very critical, because we now see a lot of states are justifying even regression on environment protection and fundamental rights to justify the need for economic recovery.
Yes.
And that is very dangerous if we go to that track instead of fast tracking, as you said, the implementation on the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights. And the other thing that really is needed is the issue of access to justice, access to remedy, and accountability, because they come together. And thanks for highlighting women and indigenous peoples, because these are really the ones not provided the access to justice, but also the participation in the different processes from national to global level. So thanks again for that, Dante. We will get back to you, especially if there are questions from the participants. But there are 2 points that I also want to mention here. One is that for our participants, we will share to you what Dante has presented by email, because he has that written down. So don't worry, you will get it. We will send it to you. And second is that the report that Dante has mentioned, which is the report prepared by IPGIA, the International Work Group on Indigenous Affairs, and later updated with the cooperation of IPRI on the state of implementation of the UNGP in terms of progress, gaps, and challenges. And for us to have further discussion on this with more indigenous participants, we will have a launching of the report on July 1, and we are happy that Dante is joining us again in the launching of that event. So please, and we will also circulate, of course, to you the report, right? So that's just.
And I have to say,
yes.
And I have to say, Joanne, that the report is a very good one. And I will say that the recommendations that are made in the report to the different players in society, let's say, it is pretty good to states, to international organizations, to business, to civil society, and to indigenous people themselves or yourselves. I think it's very clear. It's easy to understand. And I have to say that I tend to agree with pretty much everything that is said. The power imbalance, the frustration that to a certain extent it's tangible in the report on this gap between perceived or not perceived good intentions and things that are in paper but not in practice, that is something that keeps me awake and our working group awake too. So we have a common ground, and this report is a very good input, was already and will be already again when we move into the roadmap that will be developed during the months to come. So thanks again for that, because it's a very fine report.
Okay, thanks. That stands for that, Dante. Now we move on to the national level, because we want to see how the UNGP is also what's the state of implementation at the national level. So we are very happy to have somebody with us who has been engaging on this issue on business and human rights at the national level and also at the global level. So he can share his perspective and experiences on this. So our next speaker is a human rights attorney or lawyer with the Lawyers Association for Human Rights of Nepalese Indigenous Peoples. He's a legal advisor for numerous indigenous organizations in Nepal, and he provides advice to promote, protect, and defend human rights of indigenous peoples in Nepal and other countries. So our next speaker is Shankar Limbu. So Shankar, from your active engagement at the national and global levels on business and human rights in relation to indigenous peoples, what is your assessment on the implementation of the UNGP by the government in Nepal and investors in Nepal, and also the engagement of indigenous peoples on this? So Shankar?
Hi, Joanne. Thank you very much, Joanne, and then thank you very much for the time. Hello, everybody. Greetings from Nepal. In terms of talking about implementation of UNGP in a national level, I would like to say that it's neither negative nor positive either. So this makes like very funny punchline. Though the UNGP has become like 10 years old, in the context of Nepal, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that it is still in infant stage. I have not seen the government's clear, concrete commitment to implement duly by making national action plan. However, the UNGP has been a part of 5th National Human Rights National Action Plan of the government. The Human Rights National Action Plan comprises an objectives of motivating the business entities to pursue the UNGP, which is the positive things. And the 3 tier of the government, including federal, provincial, and local, have the responsibility to substantiate it. Business entities, trade unions, and civil societies are identified as a partner in this regard. The National Human Rights Commission has been closely working with the Lawyers Association for Human Rights Nepalese Indigenous Peoples, Lahorni, that I represent, that organization, in order to promote the UNGP. In our work, IPRI is consistently partnering with us. That is significant for indigenous peoples in Nepal. So basically, it's an effort, a multi-factors effort that we are making in Nepal. So also the supports from the international, partnering from the international organization who have like very good understanding about the UNGP, that is also very significant. On the other hand, Nepal is a party to various international core and other human rights laws, including ICCPR, ICESCR, CERT, ILO Convention 169, and UNDRIP. The Treaty Act of Nepal gives a higher status to the international laws than the national laws. Referring to the international laws, the Supreme Court of Nepal has established a number of jurisprudence to regulate business activities that run in the name of development. Despite the fact reality on the ground is different, so ground reality is basically different. Recently, Nepal Electricity Authority under the Ministry of Energy planned to construct the high voltage transmission line middle of the village named Dumkibas, which is a rural village. changing the original route without having an environmental impact assessment and obtaining consent from the indigenous peoples and consulting to the locals. The government deployed the police force and attacked brutally against women, elderly people, and other affected people. The project was funded by the World Bank. The Supreme Court issued a temporary stay order to halt the project activities. First, the police denied entering to the court order. This shows that even the law is there, even there is the court regulation. It's very difficult that can be implemented or that can be obeyed by the government agencies in Nepal. Probably that's the case in other countries as well. But later that they left the villagers, but arrested 3, including 1 woman. The World Bank country international team working in the same sector responded to the issue timely manner, and they asked the government to settle the issue amicably and halt the project until the issue is resolved. Among the other international national law, we have used the UNGP in this case. We are eager to see that how the Supreme Court interprets the UNGP in the final hearing of the case. In the amid of COVID pandemic and starting the monsoon, people faced the floods and landslide in Melamchi. Joanne, you know very well, you visited in that area as well a long time ago. There is a massive devastating floods. Many people lost their homes and turned homeless, sustaining in a miserable condition. The ADB-funded Melamchi water supply project is a mega project diverting the 3 rivers to Kathmandu for drinking water. And the project is in that location. 11 people were killed, including 1 Indian and 2 Chinese workers working in the project. 25 people are missing. More than 150 houses are indebted due to the floods. There was an agreement with indigenous peoples to comply the ILO Convention 169, including adopting the environmental impact mitigation measures. That agreement, but the agreement has not complied. I'm sure that project activities have contributed to a lot to the natural disaster. The affected people blaming those constructing dams, tunnel, diverting the river, resulting landslide and floods. The question is, how did the disaster occur when though the project was safe in accordance with the environmental impact assessment and other studies reports relating to the project? And what is the relationship between indigenous people's belief system and not to hurt to the sacred mountain, what it called that Amayangri, they consider as a sacred mountain, and the protection of the nature that include the physical landscape and the environment? The project plan was to construct the dam, tunnel, and other infrastructure on the Amayangri mountain region. So looking globally, acting locally. So this is like very popular saying, but what I see is acting globally and fighting locally. That is maybe we have to think about it. The last point about engaging to the international level has mainly 3 dimensions: to become a part of international process, to the identity of indigenous peoples and associated rights are not to be left behind. Distinct peoples' diverse knowledge and experience can be shared with the international community and make a distinct contribution based on the indigeneity to promote the UNGP. Second one is like human rights violation cases against indigenous people can be brought into the international attention to seek the potential solution by engaging in international level. It gives an avenue for a dialogue with the relevant actors and the stakeholders to create environment for resolving the problems. The third one is to bring the collectively made global ideas into the national and community level. So the objectives of UNGP can be used by the community. The challenge is the perception and the attitude of the government and business entity towards the human rights are problematic. They take human rights as an obstacle of the development, and they also take as a political interest of the Western country. So the nation human rights institution and organization have to put more effort into recognition of indigenous people's human rights, particularly in the sector of business and human rights, and combating against development aggression that take place in the ancestral land of indigenous people. Formulating national action plan on UNGP is challenging, but we cannot wait implementation of human rights instrument by government and business entity. Thus, we need to look for alternative and available standards mechanism to establish new tripartite mechanism that comprises representatives of indigenous peoples, government, and business entities. Okay.
Oh, I think you're cut. Hello? Hello? Yeah, I think he is concluding anyway. But we'll get back to Shankar at the end. Thanks for that, Shankar. There are several points that Shankar has highlighted at the national level on the implementation of the UNGP. One is the National Action Plan. That is actually the concrete supposed to be event or embodiment of the implementation of the UNGP at the national level, which should be formulated with the participation of rights holders and other stakeholders, which unfortunately did not happen in the case of Nepal. Second is, he also highlighted the role that national human rights institutions are doing by promoting the UNGP at the country level, which helps raise awareness by different actors on the need to implement the UNGP. And the third point is the need to anchor the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and ILO 169 when we talk about business and human rights relating to Indigenous peoples. That's a very core central issue when we're talking of Indigenous peoples and business and human rights. So these are the two international human rights instruments that should be guiding how the NAPs and other actions, including mechanisms for redress, should be addressed. And the other thing that Shankar has highlighted is who is responsible when there are disasters related to business projects. Who takes the responsibility? And also the compensation of the victims for this issue. And finally, thanks Shankar for also highlighting the usefulness of engaging at the global level, because that's also where we can raise the perspective, the voices of Indigenous peoples, the human rights, the realities on the ground in terms of violations that's happening, but also getting into dialogue with the other relevant actors on how the UNGP can be implemented. So thanks again, Shankar, for giving us a concrete picture on the lack and the challenges that Indigenous peoples face at the national level on the implementation of the UNGP. Now we move to another country, which is in Latin America, and this time it will focus on the issue of the impacts and access to justice, the impacts of business and access to justice. Because under the UNGP, the third pillar is on access to justice, which is both the obligation of states and business. So our next speaker, she is a strong woman leader from the Sarayaku community or Sarayaku people in Ecuador. So Patricia Gualinga is an Indigenous rights and environment defender and foreign relations representative of the Quechua Sarayaku people in Ecuadorian Amazon. Patricia is a national and international leader of the Sarayaku, and she's a spokeswoman that promotes the call to keep fossil fuels underground in the Amazon. So Patricia, I'm really happy that you are here with us. There's at least the two of us women in this panel, but it's good to share, to hear from you that on the issue of your struggle. So the Sarayaku people are known internationally for their strong opposition to the petroleum mining, in the territory of Sarayaku. Can you tell us more on your engagement with the government and business to assert your rights, and what mechanisms did you use for access to justice? So, Patricia, you have the floor.
Muy buenos días. Gracias.
Good morning. Thank you, Joanne, for your invitation. Good morning, brothers, sisters. It's true that Sarayaku has had a long fight, and it's still resisting. That's the word we use, resistance, because up to now we have been very clear. We don't let extractivist companies enter our territory. And by extractivist companies, I mean mining, wood companies, access to roads. And why do we exercise this resistance? Well, because we have witnessed the environmental disaster that has been caused to indigenous peoples in other provinces by these companies. That's why Sarayaku took this very radical decision. This decision saw women at the forefront and the support of all the peoples. It's important to mention that women led this resistance. Our relationship with companies is not very good because we defend our territories, our rights, our relationship can't be very polite with these companies because our government, without that free, prior, and informed consent, wants to see that consultation as a bureaucracy, as kind of something you do for manners, to socialize. They come and inform us that they are going to use our lands and start extractivist activities. In this context, we show resistance to the state, and we say that that is not true. Our collective rights don't work like that. The Convention 196 and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People say otherwise. The case of Sarayaku lasted for many, many years. It went from national justice to the Inter-American human rights system. We have a ruling from the Inter-American Human Rights Court in favor of the Sarayaku peoples because we have given visibility to the violation of human rights in our territory and the relationship of these violations of human rights with the complicity of companies, extractivist companies, which is something we see in many other communities, even though there's a fight for our human rights and there's an international framework to defend human rights. There are guiding principles. States such as Ecuador and others keep violating these rights the same way as they have done for years. Some small things are starting to change little by little, but they are still operating in the same way. What mechanisms have we used to defend our rights? Well, first of all, the legal mechanism that gave us access to the Inter-American human rights system and also a solid organization, robust organization from our peoples as First Nations. We validated our rights and we said they are not going to enter our territories. There are many other communities that say this. It would be a bad business for companies right now to fight against us, to fight against our organization, our self-governance, given the legal mechanisms that we have. So they need to see how they enter our territories. Other communities with the same rights have started this collective resistance as well. They have stated firmly they will not come and violate our human rights because as First Nations, I have that self-determination right and I have this international framework behind me to support me. Sarayaku is a symbol of resistance because of this. For many other indigenous peoples, it has created jurisprudence, legislation, information, awareness raising, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has given the visibility to the free, prior, and informed consent, which is the legal framework in which companies have to operate. And governments just don't want to understand that. They don't want to understand how our human rights and our indigenous rights have to be applied, how the guiding principles must be applied. I think we will have to fight as much with the guiding principles for them to be applied as much as we have for other rights, because states don't want to apply them. And this is a huge problem. Companies want to come and make profits. They don't want to come and respect our rights. That's what we are fighting in our territories. We want the Amazon to exist, to have that balance in the world with the environment. In the case of the COVID pandemic, we have fought against our climate crisis and our pandemic by ourselves because we haven't had access to the proper healthcare. We have had to manage our own resources. We have had to tell the government of our own the statistics to be taken into account. We can't allow the extractivist companies to reach our lands because there's an economic crisis and they just can't exploit our territories more. That's our conviction. Thank you so much for listening to us.
Thanks a lot, Patricia. It's always encouraging to hear your stories because it gives us strength and also lessons from your very strong and solid organization in fighting back the extractive industries. And I like what you said, that it's bad business for companies to fight Indigenous peoples defending their lands. That's I think the kind of narrative that we should be promoting. But also the one that in relation to the access to justice, what you have mentioned here is that you have used the legal framework, international, like in reference to ILO 169, and has used the Inter-American Court, which has supported your right. But the importance, and this is I think another key element here, the importance that the Inter-American Court has made their decision is the need for the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples when it comes to business operations in their territories. And as you have said, FPIC should be the guide for companies to engage or operate in Indigenous territories. This should be the social license required to companies when they operate. And you have proven that this is the right thing to do based on the decision of the Inter-American Court. So I hope this really sets and strengthens further the need for the human rights due diligence that should include free, prior, and informed consent. But finally, again, to mention what you have said, that states do not have the political will to implement their rights or protect the rights, and companies operate because they want profit. It's not to protect rights. So for Indigenous peoples, it's important that we fight back, that we defend our resources and assert our rights on this. So thanks a lot for those, Patricia. Now we move on to the other player, which is quite interesting because we are now dealing with business. But the business that we will be engaging with are within our own community, Indigenous business. So our next speaker is an Indigenous leader engaged in business as a trust fund, supported by different companies in Canada. So Mark, he is the Mohawk member of the Six Nations of the Grand River First Nation in Ontario, Canada. He's a senior advisory and founding member of the National Aboriginal Trust Officers Association, and in partnership with the Shareholders Association for Research and Education, and is contributing leader to the Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative. Mark is the general manager of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation Community Trust, with a 25 million First Nation-based trust fund. So Mark, as an Indigenous leader engaging in business as a trust fund supported by Canadian companies, how are you able to put Indigenous people's rights, including the conduct of FPIC or the free, prior, and informed consent, at the core of your business operations? And what can other business enterprises learn from your experience and model in upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples? Mark, you have the floor.
Sego and Yawan, Joan, and the UNGP for having me. I appreciate it. Greetings from Six Nations of the Grand River. I'm coming at this from, and hopefully I'll give you a little bit of background of our story, and hopefully this will answer that question. I've been the general manager for the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation Community Trust for 21 years. And through that work, we created the National Aboriginal Trust Officers Association to assist other Indigenous communities in Canada who've settled land claims and other agreements and have an influx of large amounts of money into their and set up a trust fund. So we're approaching this issue as shareholders. It's something that we had set up and dealt with the appropriate investment professionals, but we realized we were just handing our money over to a group of non-Indigenous people and hoping they made good decisions on our behalf while generating much needed revenues for our communities. So in 2015, Canada produced a report called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report on looking into Indigenous peoples' experience with residential schools. And out of that report, they developed 94 calls to action. And specifically, call to action 92 calls on the corporate sector in Canada to participate in reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And it specifically stated that that the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples could be utilized as a reconciliation framework, that business is responsible for engaging with Indigenous communities where resource-based projects are concerned. It also calls on business to provide opportunities and employment and training for Indigenous peoples, and also to educate its own workforce on the histories of Indigenous peoples in Canada in terms of history, residential schools, laws, and Crown relations between the government and Indigenous peoples. So that's quite a task, but that's an opportunity for us to engage with companies who initially gave a lot of support to that. So our partnership with Share Canada is really strengthening our abilities and responsibilities as shareholders, as actual shareholders, not just stakeholders down the line within dealings with government business, but shareholders in these companies where we can actually utilize those rights to correct corporate behavior or influence corporate behavior in a way that is beneficial to our own people. And so in partnering with Share, they are part of a $70 billion network of investors with pension funds and foundations. And we created the Reconciliation Responsible Investment Initiative for two purposes. One is to help our Indigenous communities see the link between our cultural and traditional values and our investment policy. So the companies that we support, we cannot be contrary to the values of our own communities. The other part of it is working with non-Indigenous investors who want to utilize their invested portfolio in a way that is consistent with reconciliation. So within our work, we work with Canadian institutional investors, including Indigenous trusts, to embed Indigenous rights and commitments to reconciliation across capital markets and within Canada's corporate sector. One major aspect of our work centers upon shareholder engagement. Through Share's engagement program, representing over $70 billion in assets under management, we've engaged with over 50 Canadian and international companies to secure corporate commitments to Indigenous rights and reconciliation in the past few years. As a result, over a dozen companies have taken meaningful steps to respond to Call to Action 92 by establishing regular public disclosures on Indigenous employment and procurement, and by committing to education for management staff on Indigenous rights and histories. A recent big win we had recently is an engagement with the TMX Group, which is the company in Toronto that owns the Toronto Stock Exchange, the major exchange here in Canada. And it was this shareholder proposal was brought forward by the Atkinson Foundation, which is one of the funders of our initiative. But not only a funder, they're actively engaging with the work that we've done and bring our concepts and put it into practice. So they brought forward a shareholder proposal to TMX to produce a report on Indigenous employment engagement within their own company, to create procurement targets in dealing with Indigenous business, And initially, the board resisted, and because it was seemingly imposed upon them. But with consultation and communication with our team, we showed them the way to do that through one of the organizations here in Canada called the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, who runs what they call the Progressive Aboriginal Relations Program, which helps companies pull together and coordinate Indigenous policies and procurement standards, and it's a quite established the milestones of success to get to that point where you are fully engaged and with Indigenous peoples and communities. So after that. Those meetings, the board actually changed their recommendation to accept it. And then the shareholder vote, we got a 98% approval. And this is one of the leading financial industries in Canada. And we think this is the first of many, but leading by example in this way shows very positive work that we're doing. So, we also recognize that investors recognize that progressive Indigenous relations and rights recognition are critical for business success. Failure to conduct sufficient due diligence on Indigenous rights, particularly to seek and obtain free, prior, and informed consent can result in financial losses and material costs. Investor confidence is heightened where companies have made clear commitments to the UN Declaration, the rights of Indigenous people, and free, prior, and informed consent, as upholding rights and engaging productively with potentially impacted rights holders provides legal and regulatory certainty. So for us, coming at it from the perspective of a shareholder, and we have money in these companies, we want to protect our investment by helping them do things in the right way. Most recently, about 2 weeks ago, my colleague and I presented to a Canadian Senate committee on Bill C-15, which is our federal legislation that seeks to align Canadian laws with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it passed just last week, and it's awaiting a royal assent. So it's a great start, but we are, essentially we weren't waiting for them to act. We are operating as shareholders and coordinating the allyship through other shareholders in Canada, to get our point across and to really strengthen Indigenous rights and create the opportunity to engage with an underutilized sector of our economy for the benefit of the Canadian economy as a whole.
Wow. Thanks a lot for that, Mark. A very insightful presentation of indeed what you said, leading by example in terms of promoting and upholding Indigenous people's rights. It's a good business. But what I want to highlight are some of the key points that you mentioned. One is to act as shareholders, so that we can influence how the other shareholders behave, especially in terms of influencing corporate behavior. That traditional and cultural values needs to be compatible with investment principles, and that shareholders' engagement is important, as you have mentioned, and also the need for public disclosures of commitments makes more companies more inclined to do what they have committed. And also that the failure to seek FPIC, that companies now recognize that a failure to seek FPIC is a financial risk. It's actually a financial risk, and that having the rights recognized and FPIC in place regulates us, provides certainty and a clear regulatory framework. And I think these are the important points that we can learn for business to follow in relation to upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples. And finally, yes, we are really happy. I think the whole Indigenous world is one with you. And the biggest one of the milestone, if I may say, development in the adoption of the Bill C-15 on the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Canada. And that is really, we look forward on how that will also lead to better protection of Indigenous peoples by Canadian business. And we hope they will also abide by the UNGP in their operations abroad. So thanks a lot for that, Mark. And it really gives us a different dimension that rights recognition can actually be done in business operations. So now we move to the last but not the least of our speakers for this session. He is the founder and president of the Batani Foundation and a former member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and also a former member of the Public Chamber of Russia. Until 2010, he was the first vice president of the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, or RIPON, and a member of the UN Permanent Forum from 2005 to 2011. We are very happy to have here with us Pavel Solyanzika. And Pavel, based on your experience as the former member of the working group, what are your insights on lessons learned in advancing Indigenous peoples' rights in the work of the working group, particularly in engaging with states and business? And what are your recommendations for the next decade of implementation? Pavel. You have the floor now, Pavel.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joan. I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to you for the invitation and primarily for organizing this discussion, this talk. And I'm very happy to see my colleague, Dante, and I have learned so much from you when I worked in the working group together with you. When I gave the floor at the UN platform in Geneva for the first time, I said that I would never sit at the negotiation table with the representative of business. Why? This statement of mine was based on the experience of defending my Udege people with working with business, because business would tell us, who are you? It's not your land, not your territories. And for me, that was a very frustrating experience. But then I started helping Indigenous peoples, not only my Indigenous people, but also other peoples of Russia in negotiations with the representatives of business who tried to grab Indigenous peoples' lands for their exploitation. And as Dante has just said, among business representatives, we can see those who are trying to speak the same language with Indigenous peoples, to whose land they come to. And this work enabled me to join the working group. And this work gave me great experience of communication, of working with colleagues within this working group. And they represented different regions. And these were different expertise, different experience. And that gave me the understanding of all aspects of human rights and business. And as for the inner kitchen, so to say, of the working group, the work that is not seen, when we first met, and I mean the members of the working group, when we started discussing different issues, I tried to point out the issues of Indigenous peoples. And probably I was way too insistent. And it seemed that there was mistrust from the High Commissioner, from the colleagues of the working group. And once they even told me at the very beginning, we're not the working group on Indigenous peoples, we cannot work only on the issues of Indigenous peoples. And maybe, indeed, I was way too insistent on some issues, but I'd like to thank my colleagues because we were able to find the balance. And right now, that enables us to continue the work of this working group. And we can see high qualified professionals in human rights and business within this group. And the topic, the issues of Indigenous peoples, found its important place in the discussions, in the work of this working group on human rights. And I'm very grateful for my colleagues for their understanding, for their professionalism, and for the experience that is very valuable to me. And in my opinion, the most important conclusion for me is the preparation of 2 thematic reports for the General Assembly of the UN in the name of the working group, and we prepared these reports on the issues of indigenous peoples. And I'd like to thank Inge, Johannes, Rohr, who for the whole period of my work in the working group helped me in the preparation of these reports. A very important result of the work of the working group is that the issues of indigenous peoples right now have become the relevant issue for the working group. And indigenous peoples' rights is one of the main topic of the forums of business and human rights. And all that became possible thanks to the support of the working group, of the High Commissioner, and the insistence of the indigenous peoples themselves. Indigenous peoples' issues have become very important in the discussions at the regional meetings of the working group in various areas of the world. I took part in the work in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia region. As for the proposals for the upcoming 10 years, for the upcoming decade, I would probably recommend or advise my colleagues, my brothers and sisters of the indigenous peoples to continue this insistent work on defending human rights, indigenous peoples' rights related to the business of violations of human rights. And we need to prepare experts and specialists because we need to understand that the documents and their implementation is a very complicated process, and we need the understanding at the level of experts. And that is why it's important for youngsters among indigenous peoples to understand all the details and all the complicated issues within these documents. And also the guiding principles are part of the international standards, just as the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And we need to take that into account in our activities and use the guiding principles so that all the other international standards on indigenous people's rights should be taken into account. Another important point is related probably to the recommendations to the states or governments or even to the business. It's allocating resources for indigenous people's communities who suffer from business activities or who can potentially suffer from that, because indigenous peoples need to implement all the necessary provisions. But for that, we need the resources and the opportunities, because unfortunately, many indigenous peoples do not know about the possibilities, about how they can do it. And finally, there's a recommendation to the government. It's to create or to improve the mechanisms for the implementation of guiding principles within the countries at the national levels. We have seen the different opportunities, such as working with such as attorneys and on human rights, on indigenous people's rights, but there are no individuals who specifically work on the abuse of indigenous people's rights. And that is why these standards and the mechanisms should be taken into account, such as guiding principles. Mark's report, the representative of business, was very interesting today. He talked about the activities that are taking place. And unfortunately, for many indigenous people's communities, the story that Mark shared with us, the experience in Canada, it seems like it's a voice from people from other planet, because for indigenous peoples, unfortunately, it's very far to reach that point because we will have the whole path and a lot of work to be done before we can reach that level. And finally, as a former member of the working group, I had many official visits to different countries, and we met with the governments, with the business, with the indigenous peoples, with the experts, with the local communities. And based on those negotiations, I can say that when you talk with the government, with the business representatives, you can see one story, one picture. But when you speak with indigenous peoples, with the communities of indigenous peoples, with the local communities, they tell you about the same story, but the picture is completely different. And the general impression was that those people who live in one and the same region, in one and the same country, they speak on one and the same issue, but it seems that they live not in different countries, not in different cities, but on different planets. And that is why our activities, those who protect indigenous people's rights, should be based on the following idea. People, regardless of whom they represent, the government or the business or the indigenous peoples, they need to have the same picture. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Joanne.
Yeah.
Once again, thank you for the invitation to take part in this very important discussion.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Pavel, for sharing your experience as a member of the working group, but also your recommendations coming from that experience and moving forward. I picked up some which were not mentioned earlier in terms of the recommendations. One is the need for indigenous peoples to also, as you said, increase our expertise and our capacities to be able to understand and prepare necessary documents or interventions, particularly on the issue of access to justice. And your also recommendation for states and government to allocate resources for victims of human rights, especially in areas where they are not aware, and thereby they cannot prepare anything to seek justice to the violations committed against them. And finally, the challenge that you have highlighted, that there are conflicting views between indigenous peoples, business, and states, and there needs to be a common understanding, and that is exactly what the UNGP is providing, a common platform. It's just a question of, again, we mentioned earlier, the lack of political will of states and business to implement those guiding principles, and thereby it makes us more. It's a big challenge for us as indigenous peoples to push that they should follow that framework and not their own narrow interests. So it's still a long way to go, but at least we have as you mentioned, the UN guiding principles and other international human rights instruments that we can use as our tool in advancing and promoting our rights. So thanks again for that, Pavel. We only have 5 minutes left. I'm really sorry about the time. It's always a challenge to manage the time. I noted that there are questions in the Q&A. Some are comments, but many are around the issue of FPIC. And who among the panelists can quickly respond if you have read the questions? Is there anyone who wants to respond to the questions in the Q&A? I think the question, can the panelists share if the COVID-10 has any effect on business? I think that was well covered by the different speakers. One main issue is the implementation of the FPIC. And Yeah, anyone who wants to comment on that among the panelists? Okay, Dante, quick
Yes,
remark. Yeah.
On looking after consent, and it's something that we have presented and discussed with business in our country visits, but also in the dialogue that we have with business associations. We say that is the basis for legitimacy. So business is only going to be able to be sustainable or to be viable or to exist if they are legitimate in the eyes of those impacted or let's say right holders. Therefore, the free, prior, informed consent is a prerequisite. It's a condition in order to actually even exist as a business organization. And we have gone further to say the same approach, the same logic, the same lens should apply for business, so for indigenous people, of course, but you can apply the same rationale to any community that is going to be or is being impacted by business activities. And you don't have to be, let's say, indigenous to be vulnerable. So indigenous, of course, but in fact, anyone that is impacted or potentially going to be impacted by business it's in business interest, as some of you said actually, to do things rightly. If you have a solid project, if you have taken all the preventions, if you have taken into consideration all the negative or side effects or impacts, etc., and if you're transparent about the impacts and benefits, yes, but also the negative impacts, if you trust in the merits of your project, you should challenge your project and you should invite people to challenge your proposal in order to make it viable. Yeah, so that's a very very important thing. And the other thing that we have said is that in terms of good intentions or let's say, we have said in the negotiation between business and indigenous people, there is an intrinsic unbalance of power. So you have one much more powerful than the other.
Yeah.
And therefore, the burden of good intentions has to be put on the side of the most powerful. Why? Because it's simple logic. If you and all your ancestors, since pretty much all the time, your rights have not been respected, why now it's going to be different? So it's reasonable to not trust the good intentions of governments or business. It's reasonable because the track record is awfully bad. Therefore, who has to prove that has good intentions one and again and gain trust and retain trust is the most powerful in the relation, not the historically disempowered and abused. And that's, again, a message that we have, let's say, tried to communicate to business and governments to say, this is kind of obvious common sense to think it that way. But seems that common sense is not self-explanatory. Therefore, we have been doing our effort to articulate that rationale, that logic, and something that I will be delighted if you want to quote me on this point. I'm happy to say that in any platform or fora needed, because for me, it's absolutely common sense. The approach that business should follow.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Dante. I think that's again an important point to make, that because of the imbalance of power, the one with power has bigger obligation, has bigger responsibility, right? And there is no excuse for them not being able to do their responsibilities and their obligations because they have the means to do it. And I think that's why it's not enough to have good intentions. It's more about abiding by the responsibilities and obligations. And on this point, the states and business who have the power should be able to implement their responsibilities and obligations to indigenous peoples, including the need to have free, prior, and informed consent as the social license and a prerequisite for their operations. So I think that's a very good way to conclude our session today. And thanks to all the participants. I'm really sorry that we ran out of time. Thanks again to all our panelists. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your ideas, experiences, and perspectives, which has really enriched our discussions for today. As I said, there will be another event on July 1. Please join us in that event as we focus more also from indigenous peoples from other regions, and also onto what steps can we take or the recommendations for the next 10 years. So, and finally, before I conclude this, we actually prepared a video on indigenous peoples' business and human rights, which we want to present after this. But again, to thank everyone for your participation, and we look forward for your that you stay to watch the video, but also to join us on July 1. And also, if you have the time to listen to the high-level discussion in the Human Rights Council on the issue of business and human rights. So Dante will be there. I will also be speaking. So I hope to see you in these two coming events. And thanks again. And now I also want to thank all our interpreters, by the way, and also my colleagues and IPGIA for this, and also the secretariat of the working group for their cooperation in bringing this together. So now I call on Ivan, if you can play the video, and we still want to invite everyone to watch the video. Okay. Thank you.
Indigenous Peoples and the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, UNGP. Indigenous peoples' lands, territories and resources are often regarded by the dominant states and businesses as a resource that can simply be taken and exploited.
Traditional Sami lands, they are considered state property. We are not in a position to actually define how to use these areas.
Repeatedly, these interests treat Indigenous peoples and others as an inconvenience, marginalising and abusing them and criminalising their protests. Indigenous peoples, marginalised groups and their allies came together and raised their voices at the United Nations against these abuses in the name of progress and development. After years of global discussions with failed attempts to regulate business practices in relation to human rights, it was unanimously agreed to adopt the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in June 2011. This is the UNGP. Business can create jobs, growth and infrastructure, but can also engage in corruption, pollution and human rights violations. So it is important to implement the guiding principles to ensure businesses respect and protect human rights. The UNGP is also an integral element of the Sustainable Development Goals, providing a framework for business as key partners to achieve sustainable development for all. What is the UNGP framework? The UNGP is a voluntary framework applicable to states and businesses. It clarifies their duties and responsibilities in relation to human rights when doing business. These apply to all states and to all business enterprises, both small and large, local and international. The UNGP consists of 3 pillars: protect, respect, remedy. Protect. The state's duty is to protect against human rights abuses by the state and business through appropriate policies, regulation, and adjudication.
Your government duty is to make sure that the business entities, including private entities, they should make sure that guiding principle, UNGP, should be implemented to make sure that indigenous people's right is not violated.
Respect. Businesses shall respect and prevent human rights violations related to their business activities, in addition to due diligence to identify any potential issues. Remedy. States and businesses should ensure access to effective remedies for rights violations and abuses through both judicial and non-judicial mechanisms. Supporting the UNGP. The UNGP is overseen by the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Their mandate is to promote the UNGP, identify good practices, make recommendations for effective remedies, monitor alleged human rights abuses and intervene if necessary, and importantly, guide the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. The UN Forum on Business and Human Rights is an annual 2-day event. It serves as a global platform for stakeholders to discuss trends and challenges and promote dialogue and cooperation on issues linked to business and human rights. The participation of Indigenous peoples within the forum enables them to advocate for the inclusion of the collective rights enshrined in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNGRIP. Raise awareness on the human rights abuses and violations committed against them. To advance and develop a common position and recommendations. Engage directly with members of the working group. Network and strengthen solidarity with NGOs and other allies. Engage with financial institutions, businesses and states and other relevant actors.
One thing that needs urgent improvement in the Business and Human Rights Forum is the participation of women as part of the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights.
The importance of taking part cannot be overemphasized. It is fundamental that Indigenous peoples engage at the different levels: international, regional, and national. Implementing the UNGP, National Action Plans, NAP. To implement the UNGP at national level, states are committed to develop National Action Plans, the NAP. These should be developed through a multi-stakeholder platform, including Indigenous peoples.
There should be a mechanism the Indigenous peoples can freely participate within the whole development process, not only the development process, but lawmaking and law reforming process as well.
An NAP should include commitments by the states on how business will be regulated, how the 3 pillars will be implemented. Unfortunately, this process appears to be poorly implemented, even with the support of the working group. A decade of UNGP implementation. After 10 years of the UNGP, challenges still remain as the rights of Indigenous peoples continue to be ignored and violated by states and businesses.
For example, on the Norwegian side, there is the Fosen wind power plant, which is, I believe, the biggest wind power park in Europe. And that is built on traditional Sami territories and without consent from the community who are the traditional users of the area.
The NAPs in many countries missed the opportunity to address wide-scale violation of human rights, as well as developing policies to implement the standards enshrined in UNGRIP. This includes free, prior and informed consent, FPIC, and the recognition of customary justice systems as part of the remedy pillar. However, progress has been made that benefits Indigenous peoples, including voluntary due diligence by businesses, an increase of NAPs with the participation of Indigenous peoples, raised awareness and attention to human rights abuses. Indigenous peoples have also developed their own FPIC protocols as a foundation for their engagement with businesses and states. There are examples proving that collaboration can work. In Australia, a participation agreement was created between Argyle Diamonds and the UNGPs, Malning and Woolnar peoples on whose lands an Argyle mine sits.
There are some good experience, but there are some not so good experiences on these mines. We want people here have a job, but they don't actually do that. And there's also a lot of environmental issues.
In the Arctic, the Sami people successfully campaigned to have Stora Enso, a multinational paper company, change its wood procurement practices.
We have been directly addressing different companies to build pressure, because companies often want to maintain some kind of image of being respectful towards human rights, towards Indigenous people's rights, environmental standards, and so on. So that is some strategy that can work, especially nowadays that social media can be used very effectively to mobilize a lot of attention.
Regional and national progress has been seen in Latin American countries, but it remains a very dangerous environment for human rights defenders. What do Indigenous peoples want over the next 10 years?
What we want to see in the next 10 years of the business and human rights is that Indigenous peoples are treated with respect, dignity, and rights. And this requires a change of behavior by companies and states in dealing with Indigenous peoples, in the way they regard our lands, territories, and resources, that these lands, territories, and resources are not just for commercial use, but they have different values for Indigenous peoples. They are part of our culture, they are part of our dignity, and they are not just for exploitation, for business to make profit. And we need to understand that these resources are also important for the sustainability of the planet.
There are differences between the hopes related to states, business, and among Indigenous peoples themselves, but there are fundamentals that form the foundation of the cooperation required to achieve a sustainable balance between business, human rights, and Indigenous peoples. So, what is it that Indigenous peoples are hoping for? Integration of the UNDRIP in the UNGP implementation, including the proper application of FPIC. Recognise, respect and support community-driven FPIC protocols and guidelines when engaging with Indigenous peoples. Establish effective mechanisms for the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples in the development of NAPs and in the UNGP regional and global processes.
The government agencies, they should recognize Indigenous peoples in first place, and then also they should recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples. And when to recognize the right to Indigenous peoples, it is important to recognize the international human rights instruments that guarantee the rights of Indigenous people.
Establish effective mechanisms for Indigenous peoples' access to remedy at project, national, regional and global levels, as well as the integration of Indigenous customary justice systems aligned to human rights instruments. Conduct outreach for awareness raising on the rights of Indigenous peoples and the UNGP.
Lack of recognition, legal recognition of our traditional territories. So of course that would address the problem at its root if our tenure rights would be legally recognized. Of course, this is not news to any indigenous peoples, but that is often the root of the problem, that we are considered not the owners or the custodians of our lands, but merely somebody who has to be consulted when others make decisions over us.
Inclusiveness at all stages, particularly with the participation of Indigenous women and youth. Our greatest hope is for a just, equitable and sustainable world with respect for diversity and the dignity of all its people.
Thank you to those who stayed to watch the video. I hope that puts a bit more, it captures a lot of the discussions that we had today. And by the way, for my colleagues, that will also have subtitles in different languages. So we will be working on the other languages so that there will be more, we can disseminate it more broadly. But thank you again for joining us and in watching this the video. And I still see all our speakers who watch the video. I hope you like the video as well. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Have a good day.